2018, I wrote a big story for The Atlantic about whether America was ready for the next big pandemic. I'd been thinking about this concept of preparedness for a long time, but it still felt very abstract and nebulous to me. And I really wanted to look at the things, the people, the ideas that would make or break a country's response. And for much of this year, I've been looking at how that response has indeed broken and all the reasons for that. This is an omni-crisis. It touches so many different facets of our reality. It has upended so much, and it is very difficult to make sense of what is going on. And that's what I've hoped to do for my readers. Help them make sense of this crucial, generation-defining, confusing mess that we're all stuck in.
The original tip that led me to this came in 2008 from a radio show host named Joe Graydon. He hosts a show called The People's Pharmacy, and he contacted me to say that a number of his listeners were calling in with complaints about their generic drugs. These were credible complaints, and when he took them to the FDA, officials there argued that it was probably psychosomatic, because if people's pills look different than they usually do, that may affect how they react. And Joe didn't buy it. And he just posed this question to me: what is wrong with the drugs? And I could not get that question out of my head. At that point, I couldn't imagine that it would take me on a decade-long reporting journey, but it did.
My story is about how difficult it's been to eliminate cigarette butt litter, and how there are people trying to get cigarette filters banned altogether. And while there's an environmental argument for that, there may also be a public health argument, because cigarette filters can make smoking more dangerous to the smoker. I started looking into cigarette butts because a few years ago I had read some stories about how birds had been seen leaving cigarette butts into their nests. And the thought was that the toxins in the filters could possibly act as an insect repellent, maybe keeping parasites away from the nest. And looking into that kind of opened the door on this whole huge cigarette butt litter issue, and how despite policies and campaigns and all kinds of efforts to curb it, just nothing has worked. And cigarette butts remain this kind of invisible, socially accepted form of litter.
My story is a profile of Saul Kassin. He's a psychologist at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and over the last 3 decades he's done a series of brilliant studies showing that the methods police use to interrogate suspects tends to lead to false confessions. They're coercive and psychologically pressure creating, and over the years his work has been cited by the Innocence Project in freeing many people who were falsely convicted by confessing to crimes they never committed.
My story is about my brother, who suffered a catastrophic motorcycle accident, sustained a traumatic brain injury, woke up more impulsive and violent than before, and eventually committed a crime. It tells this story and the implications it raises for neuroscience and the law, alongside my own development as an aspiring neuroscientist, as I realize the problems that accompany assigning a biological basis to crime.
I spent 2019 as a member of ProPublica's local reporting network, working with the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate. Together with a team of people, we spent a year investigating pollution from the oil and gas industry in a corridor of Louisiana known as Cancer Alley that runs between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. This part of Louisiana is already inundated with many oil refineries and chemical plants, and there are clusters of these plants in low-income minority communities. So we really wanted to dig into that and find out why Louisiana is not regulating these polluters the way that maybe they should be.
My story followed a NASA rocket team as they traveled to Svalbard, which is an archipelago in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, and they launched 2 sounding rockets through the northern lights in this narrow region called the CASW, which is basically where Earth's magnetic field bends down into the atmosphere and the solar wind can come pouring directly in and bits of oxygen in our atmosphere escape. So they were there to try to study this oxygen outflow, and we were there to document the whole process.
In a nutshell, my piece is about why digging in the dirt or getting dirty is good for your health. there's been this idea for decades called the hygiene hypothesis, which is now referred to as the old friends hypothesis, which basically says that there are microorganisms in the dirt around us that impact our bodies in beneficial ways. And this particular piece is about a fat that lives in those microorganisms that may actually have an impact on our mental health. And when exposed to it, we may actually be more resilient to stress.
One of the pieces I wrote was about how researchers who are studying the human microbiome, or the community of bacteria that live inside our bodies, are grappling with the really complicated ethics of collecting fecal samples from indigenous people. And the big issue here is that collecting feces is kind of a sensitive matter, and all that is set against the backdrop of the fact that indigenous people have a really long history of being exploited by Western scientists who have come in, collected samples from them, sometimes without their permission or knowledge, and left without giving them any of the benefits